In this video, we will talk about school finance and productivity. This video is based on Chapter 11 of Lunenburg and Ornstein's Educational Administration Concepts and Practices, published in 2011 by Cengage Learning. We will begin by talking about education and economics in the US. We will move on to talking about school effectiveness and productivity. We will talk about school finance trends in the US. Then we will discuss, some graphs presenting international comparisons of educational spending. All right, so this chapter is really heavily U.S. focused. So it almost like most of it is about the U.S. Educational system. So the US schools are supported financially by local, state, and federal revenues, with the greatest share derived from state sources and the smallest share from the federal sources. Okay, so since the early 20th century, state support has increased dramatically. Local support has been more or less reduced, and federal support grew until the early 1990s and then leveled off. This is according to this chapter 11 in Lunenburg and Ornstein. Okay, we will look at some graphs later, but this is what how the authors of this book summarize trends in educational expenditure in the United States. In the US, school finance is based on the principle of equality of opportunity. Nevertheless, wide variation exists in the financial ability amongst states and within states, at the local school district level to support education. So basically, not all states or school districts can finance education equally well. Because of the way the educational system developed in the United States and the way it is funded, as we discussed, from different sources, right? Local, state, federal revenues, right? There's a lot of between state and within state variability. So within the same geographical location, you could see two neighboring school districts doing completely drastically differently from each other in terms of their financial well-being. Poorer school districts in the US tend to receive more money from their respective states than do wealthier school districts, right? And poorer states, especially those in the South and Southwest, tend to receive more money from the federal government than do wealthier states and states in the Northeast and Midwest. And one thing that should be noted, despite that difference, right, despite the fact that poorer states get more money from the federal sources, this additional amount of revenue received rarely makes up for the total difference in expenditures. So those poorer, school districts and states, they still might be lacking funding. So in the US, there are 6 basic methods the states can use to finance public education, and they are discussed in detail in this chapter, and you can also easily Google that. Couple of comments. The oldest and most unequal method of, funding public education in the U.S. is called the flat grant model. Basically, when there is a fixed amount which is multiplied by the number of students who attend a given school or school district. Okay, this is the oldest one, but its research has shown over and over that this is a very unequal method of allocating money for public education. The most common methods of finance, school finance, are based on some type of equalization plan, which to supplement less wealthy school districts, give them more money. One of them is the power equalizing plan, which basically, applies inverse ratios of wealth, right? And also the weighted student plan, which basically deals with special characteristics of students and special programs, right? So if there are more of certain kind of students, then this school district or school is given more money. Okay, these are the most common methods more recently. Another method is using choice as an option, right? So basically allowing the money to follow the student, right? so-called voucher schools. Developing a budget for a school or school district can be classified into 4 major activities, and Lunenburg and Ornstein offer 4, division of the budgeting activities into 4 phases or steps, right? The first is planning or identifying priorities. The second is analysis, dealing with goals to evaluate criteria. The third is establishing priorities and negotiating. And finally, control your budget, right? Deal with inventory, receipts, and disbursement. Pretty obvious, right? So I'm not gonna talk much about this. Let's move on. An interesting part of this chapter is about school effectiveness and productivity, right? So, well, this is not a comprehensive course in school finance. It's just a topic treated in one chapter in a book, so on it for educational administrators, and it's aimed. The aim of this book in general and of this chapter in particular is to give future educational administrators, and future teachers also, some an overall glance at some key issues in looking at school effectiveness and productivity. Okay, so very often when we talk about school effectiveness and productivity, we deal with really economic research, right? And a lot of those things, we have many beliefs, kind of conventional wisdom kind of things. We think we know a lot about school effectiveness and productivity, right? But if we look at the data is not so straightforward. Often it is fuzzy, very difficult to analyze, but econometricians, economists, they have come up with ways to gain insights even from that kind of fuzzy data, right? So if we look at the data, we might find that our conventional wisdoms or opinions or beliefs that we have been holding for years and decades maybe, right? It might be wrong. Okay, so one example from this book is the conventional wisdom that larger schools are more efficient, right? So in the US, this has been very popular, has been popularized by many authors, right? That maybe because like large means like growth, right? It's good. So we thought that larger school districts are more efficient. They are basically they have something to offer to like everybody, to all students, right? So there was the conventional wisdom holds that larger schools are more efficient, right? So research shows the opposite, right? So education costs per student tend to be higher in larger schools, mainly because the larger the school, the greater the administrative body should be. So there should be more administrators in those larger schools, and that drives costs up. Okay. Also, efficiency is lower in larger schools if we look at the data, right? So, especially oversized schools are a detriment of achievement for poor children. Okay, so looks like this is not the case, right? This is one example, and there are many other examples. So, whenever you think about any issue related to school effectiveness or productivity, ask yourself whether it's just some sort of belief that you have, whether it's conventional wisdom. Go ahead and search for some data, high quality data, preferably analyzed by a qualified applied statistician, probably an economist. Okay, and maybe you will be surprised to find out that your belief might be wrong. So, overall, we will not talk about, and the book doesn't really do that either. We will not talk about all the tons of research that studied different aspects of school effectiveness and productivity. So the overall summary is that most research indicates that specific items related to school effectiveness are not cost related. Okay, so we cannot basically this is kind of connected to also to the idea of the Coleman report that school resources don't matter much, it's family background, but here it's another angle, right? You cannot really just just dump money into schools and expect them to become more effective or productive. Okay, so things that make schools more effective are not cost related. Instead, they deal with organizational climate and culture, right? So let's look at some examples. This guy, Ronald Edmonds, and his co-authors, they conducted a lot of research on effective schools, focusing mostly on elementary schools. And these are the things that they found that make schools effective and productive, right? So they are, first, strong leadership. Second, orderly, humane climate. Third, frequent monitoring of students' progress. Fourth, high expectations and requirements for all students. And finally, focus on teaching important skills to all students, right? As you can see, all these things kind of have not much to do, they are not directly connected to the money related things, okay? There's another some more evidence from the Connecticut School Effectiveness Project, right? According to them, an effective school has a safe and orderly environment, a clear school mission, instructional leadership, a climate of high expectations, time on task. Well, this means basically, in effective schools, most students spend a lot of time on learning tasks that allow them to gain important skills and to learn things. Okay. Next, frequent monitoring of student progress, right? And positive homeschool relations, right? All of these things, they are not like you cannot just buy them. Okay, it's not like money directly money related. Although I would argue that to have all of this, you would have your basic financial needs to be satisfied. Um, so the next part in this chapter in this topic is school finance trends, right? So a little bit. First, let's talk about the United States because the chapter is also about it, and we want to learn about what's going on there, right? In the United States, the state of economy is such that there is significant pressure to lower school budgets and save money, right? And that's because there are competing demands for public revenues, right? There is the aging population, there are fewer households with children attending schools, and so taxpayers are not so much interested in spending more money for schools, and they're saying, hey, let's cut down, let's not spend so much, especially in the light of these findings about school effectiveness, about how money is not that this money doesn't always translate into better schools or more effective schools, right? So also one thing that is often not considered more recently in the debates focusing mostly on like performance, right, test scores and other things, one thing that people forget about is that there are school infrastructure costs, right? And the United States will need more schools, they will need to renovate existing schools, and they will need to address the environmental hazards such as asbestos or radon gas, or maybe even like things like lead in the water, and other things, right? That will require actually investing more money in schools in the future. Okay. This is something often forgotten is in debates that require, lowering educational expenditure. Okay. So let's have a look at the trends in educational spending using these graphs coming from the National Center of Education Statistics, United States source for data on education, right? This comes from the Common Core of Data, and it shows, how total expenditures for elementary and secondary education evolved over time in the U.S. We can see that in the early 90s, they were around $280 billion per year, and they consistently grew over time. And then this is the most recent year available here in this graph is 2004 and 5. That was over 500 billion annually, right? And you can see that you know uh, in contrast to what Lunenburg and Ornstein have been saying, and overall, the total, local expenditure, that means money coming from local property taxes to fund public schools, all right, and this is really, actually, it doesn't say public education, but still, the pressure has been on local taxes. I mean, it's not been going like less, right? Um, More money out of local tax dollars have been spent on education in total, at least. Okay, maybe, well, if you look at per student level, maybe it was different, but in total, it didn't get easier for local taxpayers. Okay. This orange part is the state, sources of support, and we can see that yes, the state funding has been increasing over time, and while federal spending has also been slightly increasing, right, compared to like early 90s, it's been increasing, okay, and it hasn't leveled off really, right? There other sources have been slightly growing, but maybe not so much, okay. This graph shows total expenditures per pupil, okay, in contrast to this one, this is like aggregate, right, for everyone, and this is per pupil, right. You can see that beginning from 1965 up to the beginning of 2000s, the trend has been just upward and upward, right. So here in 1965 it was somewhere around 3,000, maybe 500 dollars per student. It's been growing and growing and growing and growing, and this like in early 2000s, it's been about $9,000 per pupil. So yeah, this has been increasing. Okay, so then this graph shows Title I grants for disadvantaged children. These are federal money coming to school districts or states where with more disadvantaged children, basically poorer children. So we can see that the federal government has been increasing their support beginning from 1980s. So yeah, in 2006, it was about what can I say? Is it 13ish? Well, let's say $14 billion, okay, per year annually was given from this federal government to support poorer children. This is federal spending under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also growing. Okay, we can see that it has grew drastically. Well, maybe beginning from the 1995 or so. Okay, and it reached about $25 billion in 2006. The trend, you can see that it's been growing. The educational expenditure has been growing and growing. Okay. This shows federal grants to states for special education, right? This is money given for special education programs, and you can see that it has been growing and it has increased dramatically somewhere beginning from 1995. It's federal money, federal support. Yeah. So overall, we can see that the trends in educational spending in the US, they show constant growth, at least in the graphs that we saw, which are basically up to early 2000s. Okay, so there are also international comparisons of educational spending, right? And this chapter 11 in Lunenburg and Ornstein argues that although Americans have high expenditures for public education, the results are not impressive when compared to other nations in the financial commitment to education and academic achievement, right? So let's look at some international comparisons of education spending, and this is OECD's Education at a Glance 2018, OECD indicators. So this is more recent than this book. It's more recent than Lunenburg and Ornstein's 2011 book. So let's look at it. This is based on data from 2015, right? Remember that it takes a while to collect data, to process it, and then to publish a report. Okay, so yeah, so this, although the report is from 2018, the data actually comes from basically 2015. So this is well, this report is publicly available. You can Google and find and download it and read. There are more. There is more information that I'm going to talk about today. So this is the first figure, and here we see total expenditure on education institutions per student by type of service. And you can see this is 2015. This is an equivalent USD converted using PPPs based on full-time equivalents from primary to tertiary education, right? So the blue part of these bars show core services, the black part shows ancillary services, and this kind of blank white part of the bar will be showing research and development, how much money is spent on research and development. Okay, so here we see the OECD average, right? This is the average of all OECD countries, about maybe 10-ish thousand dollars, right? US dollars, right? And let's look at the leaders, right? And this goes from the highest spending to the lowest spending in OECD. Highest spending is Luxembourg, right, with about maybe 23-ish thousand dollars, per student, right? And the second highest is the United States, 15, well, let's say 17-ish thousand dollars, right? A lot of spend on ancillary services. Next, we see Norway, Australia, UK, Sweden, Belgium, Australia, Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Ireland, Korea, France, and this is the European Union average. Okay, and you can see, well, the US is not the leader, but it is, well, the second one, right? And it's doing slightly better than European countries, but probably not that much better, right? And here we see the remaining countries, right? So maybe the situation is not that bleak. Perhaps thankful is thanks to this trends that we are observing. That the U.S. has been spending more over time. Okay. Let's look at this second graph. This is cumulative expenditure per student on educational institutions between the age of 6 and 15. Okay, and here this is again the OECD average, around $100,000, right? And where is the US here? This is Luxembourg again, number one. They spend a lot on education. Then goes Austria, Norway. United States is number 4 here, and it doesn't look much different from this countries that spend higher than the US OECD average. See, yeah, okay. This table, I know it is tiny, but I wanted to show the complete table to you. All right, this shows total expenditure on educational institutions per full-time equivalent student in 2015. Right, so here you can see that this is for upper primary, secondary, tertiary education. Right, now you can see that, well, this is sorted by in a very not very intuitive way. You would have to spend some time here, right? But basically, the United States is here, but countries here are listed in alphabetical order, right? So it's not like you cannot, just because the United States is here, it doesn't mean that it performs like the worst, right? So this gives you exact numbers and by all levels. So if you're interested, you can just what I would do is I would compare the country's value with OECD average. Okay, so you can easily see. So for example, for primary education, the United States spends about $11,727, higher than the OECD average. But look, there is Luxembourg with its 20 more than 20,000, right? And well, the United States spends about as much as the UK or maybe Sweden. Norway spends more. Korea spends about as much as the United States, yeah, and Iceland also And even Belgium and Austria, they're very close to the United States expenditure in terms of primary education. So these tables have a lot of information. You can look at it and explore, and you can compare, and always check whatever claims that you encounter in literature against data. It's a useful practice. So let's look at total expenditure on educational institutions as a percentage of GDP. Okay, this is another metric, right? So the OECD average is here. It's about 5% of GDP, right? So countries that spend more than 5% of GDP, they spend higher than the OECD average, right? And we see well, the list is quite similar. And here, look, United States isn't even the fourth. It's like the fifth, right? The first one is Norway, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Colombia, okay, Chile, and then United States, okay? So they spend about 6% of their GDP on education, right? So, yeah, okay. You can OECD publishes this education at a glance every year, so I decided to look at education at a glance published in 2018, honestly, because the quality of PDF was slightly better and my screenshots looked nicer from the education at a glance of 2018. For some reason, this PDF of Education at a Glance of 2019 didn't turn into nicer screenshots, which I could use in this presentation, but pretty much this is just using information from 2016. Okay, an interesting recent publication is the impact of COVID-19 on education, right? Insights from Education at a Glance 2020. Yeah, I don't expect too much here, but some useful information about how coronavirus is shaping or changing our the way we do education. Okay, thanks for watching.